So the military campaign was announced as completed in December last year, and there were some processes that began even before the campaign ended, but now there's more attention being paid. Something that I think is important to think about with justice processes is who's involved, and there's quite a broad scope. So, of course, you have communities that suffered the most, severe violence from ISIL, which were many, many people. Then there were also people that were displaced during the military campaign, and there's also been people that have been affected by revenge attacks who are not necessarily guilty themselves. So there is quite a broad spectrum. And then also combatants that have fought against ISIS and have claims for martyrdom or having been injured, are also making claims for justice as part of this period. There hasn't been a lot of formal justice processes so far. So there are some foreign fighters and Iraqi fighters from ISIS that have been prosecuted through the domestic counterterrorism courts. Those courts have been criticised for a lack of due process and also for not distinguishing the severity of cases between the different ISIS affiliates. Then at the same time, there's a number of localized processes that perhaps are not called justice, but are having an effect on punishment and reparation. So for example, there are security vetting processes going on at the governorate level. And basically what that is when IDPs, when Iraqis were displaced during the campaign, in order to come back to their homes, they have to get this clearance to show that they weren't part of ISIS. And this process has also been criticised for its lack of transparency, and often it will assign guilt to people that were not personally involved, but perhaps were relatives or perhaps part of a community. And then it has a number of repercussions around being banished from the community or having property taken from them. It's also a channel through which people who were involved in ISIS are referred to other processes as well. Then a second form that is currently taking place is tribal mechanisms. So in Al-Qaim, for example, there was retributive agreements between the tribes that anyone affiliated with ISIS would be sent out of the area and they would lose their property. Whereas if you look at Tikrit, there was a kind of a negotiated settlement so that the people who were displaced could return without or with much reduced fear of revenge killings. So it was like a negotiated reconciliation, for example. I think at the moment one of the most important indicators of justice or security perhaps taking place linked to justice is whether people feel safe to return. So about 3.2 million Iraqis have returned that were displaced, and about 2.6 million are still displaced now. The number one reason that people don't return is from a perceived lack of safety. And that's for a number of reasons. It could be that they fear ISIS coming back. It could be that they fear the security actors that are in charge, or that they just don't trust that they'll protect them. And so these processes that have been set up, when the security vetting is done well and is considered to be transparent, this is something that can offer some assurance to people that they can return. Obviously, return is more complicated. It has to do with housing and services. The vetting is not enough, but it can be one impact of the vetting is that it can assure people of their security. The flip side is that it's also been quite divisive in some communities, where if collective guilt has been assigned to people and they've been banished, then the effect on the community has been to perhaps sow new grievances that might have effects in the future as well. And equally for the tribal agreements, there have been times where it's worked as a tool of reconciliation and people have managed to return and it's avoided further violence. And then there are other times where there have been perhaps new grievances because people who were not personally involved in ISIS but their family members were, feel that has been attached to them. And so I think both of these mechanisms have both kind of supported the perception of justice and in some cases undermined it as well. Yes, I mean, I think this last period it's obviously been highly divisive for many Iraqis, but then security and some link to justice has sometimes offered opportunities for this Iraqi nationalism to develop in at least a small respect. So, for example, when security actors are perceived to be acting in the interests of the community as a whole and not only in the interests of their people from the same ethno-religious background as them, and where they're trusted by the local community, I think you do see examples of different sects or people of different communities coming together, and there being some that contributing to some nationalism. The flip side is also true that if you look in some governorates where perhaps there's a Shia actor that is perceived as not acting fairly or transparently and is seen as perhaps punishing or offering collective punishment to a Sunni population, then that's undermined this kind of nationalism. So I think what it really shows is that the vetting procedures, even though they seem they're not as publicized as an international criminal court or as a court, but they affect so many people, and they really have this effect not just on the perception of security, but also on who is guilty, who should be sent out of the community. Are we being treated? Is everyone being treated fairly as Iraqis? Is there a division between sects and between different security actors and communities? So I think they can play a really key role in either undermining or supporting Iraqi nationalism.